Hello and welcome to the Deb Calvert channel on Bright Talk. Here lately we've been doing a series, and this series is intended for sales managers, especially sales managers who are new to their role and to those who haven't had a lot of training in management. This series is monthly. Last month we talked about giving feedback to sellers. Next month we're going to talk about becoming less reactive and more proactive so that you're strengthening your leadership capacity and you're feeling more confident and you're contributing to the long-term business goals of your organization. If you would like to have more information like this, I want to let you know that we've also started a weekly series in the Connect to Sell blog. You can find that at the peoplefirstps.com website. The Connect to Sell blog is going to have an 18-week series on transitioning into sales management. So there's tons of rich content here. It's all free, and we invite you to take advantage of all of that. Today we're going to talk about candid conversations, you know, the kinds of conversations where, we'd rather duck and dodge and avoid the conversation. It's going to be uncomfortable. If we have these at all, we often end up being less direct, less candid than we really should be because we fear conflict or we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And as a result of not being candid, we can let these situations brew and we end up allowing them to cause more damage than we otherwise could have had in the situation. If you're new to Bright Talk, let me just give you a quick rundown here of what to expect. If you are listening live, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. You could post questions if you're listening live, and I'll try to take those questions as they come. Certainly we'll take questions at the end as well. If you're listening on demand, you could connect with me via LinkedIn, and I'll take your questions later. So don't worry about the fact that you weren't here live. I still want to interact with you and be able to get your questions answered. On Bright Talk, one of the features I like best is that we can load up the bonus content, and we do like to do that for you. So there, if you click on the place that it says attachments and links, you'll get slides from today's presentation. You can take notes along the way if you want to. There's an infographic that recaps some of the key points that I'll be making. And if you are looking for an accelerated version of this training, plus a lot more, there's an e-learning program that I gave you a link to as well. I'm Deb Calvert, and I work in the sales space as well as in leadership development. And this particular series is one place where I'm bringing those two worlds together to help people who are sales managers, especially those who are new to sales management or interested in becoming a sales manager, helping you to step into your full potential as a leader. Candid Conversations is our topic today, and the conversations that we're going to be focusing on are the ones that have high stakes. Those high stakes, that's part of what makes these conversations emotionally charged or intimidating or challenging to enter into. The other factor causing stress, of course, is that someone else has an opinion that's different, or someone else needs to be told something that they might not receive well. The result of the conversation is going to have an impact on you and on other people, and maybe even on the company as a whole. But you don't have to wait to practice in those high-stakes conversations. There are lots of other conversations where you can practice the skills that we'll be talking about. And one important benefit of practicing in conversations where the stakes are not high, where there's not that huge emotional charge, is that you're going to be establishing a pattern of behavior that will equip you for those bigger conversations. And along the way, you'll be developing credibility and confidence in your own abilities. Before I move forward, let's talk a little bit about why this matters. Let's talk about why you shouldn't dodge those uncomfortable conversations. You shouldn't do the easy thing and withhold your opinion. One of the reasons is that people deserve to know exactly what's going on. They deserve to have the truth. They deserve to have a situation where they aren't showing up favorably. They have a right to know in a way that is very straightforward and clear so they can understand it, so that they aren't left in the dark, continuing to make the same mistake, losing their own credibility and their own ability to make a good impression. Now, candor, it's simply the state of being open and clear in the way you express yourself. And I know it sounds simple, but we know it's not really as easy as this slide would suggest. So I want to explore more on the subject of why it's so difficult, plus why we want to go ahead and give people the clear information that they deserve. We're going to strip this right down to the fundamentals. The truth is we're wired wrong for handling stressful situations with candor and confidence. Our own emotions work against us, and there's a physiological response. It's a real one that kicks in, and all of that is perfectly normal. We need to expect it and accept it so we can work through it rather than letting all those feelings derail us in these candid conversations. Here's what's going on physiologically. Inside of you, your adrenal glands automatically begin pumping adrenaline into your bloodstream at the very moment that you think about or enter into these candid conversations. And at the same time, because of the adrenaline pumping, your brain begins diverting blood from activities that it deems non-essential to higher priority functions like running or hitting. So the blood's leaving your brain, it's going into your limbs. The large muscles of the arms and legs, they're getting more blood so that they can run away from the situation, that's flight, or they can fight the attacker. And your higher level reasoning sections of your brain are getting less blood. So you go into these tough conversations feeling like arguing or like running away because that's what your body is signaling you to do. And because there's less blood in your brain, the truth is you're not as smart as you normally would be going into these conversations at the exact moment when you want to be at your smartest. And this is all especially true if you're ever caught by surprise. You might feel extra defensive if you feel ambushed or attacked. This is basically the modern day version of encountering a saber-toothed tiger. And your internal protective programming responds in that very same way. Because the blood's not in our brain, we're not taking time to reason through that physiological response. And so that's why you might come across as being defensive or combative. And everything I just said is also true for the person that you might be entering into the conversation with. When you enter into a candid conversation to deliver some difficult feedback, for example, the recipient of your feedback might feel ambushed. Their adrenaline might start pumping. They might have a fight or flight response. They aren't going to have that blood flow in their brain to be able to respond as intelligently as they might like to. So be sure to empathize with all of that and give people a little bit of grace for their reaction. Now, in addition to our fight or flight response, we also have to deal with these barriers too. What you see on screen now, these are some of the most common obstacles to candid conversations. And you'll notice that many of these can be minimized by developing confidence in your ability to conduct these conversations with grace and with dignity and without triggering a defensive response in other people. We'll get to the skills for how to do all that momentarily. Now, you ought to use this list as a bit of a checklist to decide for yourself which barriers are most likely for you. Which ones have you encountered? What feelings, what perceptions are holding you back from conducting those candid conversations? When you know what's holding you back, well, then you know what to do to address it. Because candor is so important, and because people do deserve to hear the truth in a plain-spoken way that they can understand, because it's so important, it's really necessary to identify and address your own barriers. Here are some additional thoughts about how you can prepare yourself for these conversations. You prepare yourself for low-risk conversations first. You're going to practice where the stakes are not high so that you're ready for that inevitable time when you're ambushed into a high-stakes conversation that's uncomfortable, or you have to give feedback to somebody who's counting on you to help them succeed, to be the best that they can be. Now, I'd like you to imagine, as I walk through these, I'd like you to imagine yourself taking these 7 steps. Envision what it would look like and how it might help you. So step 1, before you go into a candid conversation, before you give somebody some tough feedback, you want to be very clear on your purpose. Why are you giving them this feedback? Presumably it's going to be to help them succeed. So remember, that's the reason. It's not that you're annoyed. It's not that you're embarrassed. It's not that you are really sick and tired of seeing this person screw up. All of those are emotional kinds of responses that will color the way that you present your feedback. So instead, be really clear about your purpose and what you're trying to do to help someone. And then as you're getting that clarity, be sure to check any assumptions you might be making. We do this. We tend to think someone's doing this for a certain reason. They're not making the cold calls, the volume that I should have asked them to make because they don't respect me. Well, that's an assumption. That might not be the reason, and you don't want that assumption, again, to change the quality of the feedback that you're going to give them. So be sure that you're checking your assumptions, particularly the ones related to the reasons that you're assuming are behind the action you're going to give feedback on. And be sure to also focus on the positive outcomes. That's going to tie back to your clarity of purpose. Your clarity of purpose is going to get you to the point where you're thinking about, what do I want them to do with my feedback? And what's the place that we're aiming for? That's the outcome. That's probably where you open this feedback. Hey, let's talk about ways that you can be more successful. And that outcome will help to keep the feedback neutral and positive. When you have all these pieces in place, you'll be able to organize your thoughts. You'll be able to give examples and specifics so it's not emotion-laden. It doesn't have any hyperbole like you always, you never. It's not vague. It's candid. It's easily understood because you're going to be very straightforward and detailed in the way you give this feedback. Now, you'll notice that I skipped something at the top there. That's because I want to ask you to think about this going into your feedback, but I also want you to use it as a check-in every step of the way. And that's to remember your own emotional triggers, particularly the ones that were related to these barriers we described. Your own emotional triggers, you could be angry at somebody, you could be fearful of how they might respond, you might feel like they are going to see a power imbalance or that they're not going to like you. Maybe you're going to feel very compassionate. You want to protect them from the truth. All of these emotional triggers you're going to think about with your own barrier, you're going to think about in your clarity of purpose, and as you're organizing your thoughts and giving these specifics and examples, you'll be sure to strip out those misplaced emotions, not because you don't want to be empathetic or aware, but because they are probably not going to serve you well as you objectively, candidly deliver feedback. Keep that in mind. We'll talk more about it in a moment. But at the very same time that you're looking at these emotional triggers that you have for yourself, you also want to consider the other person's perspective. How are they going to respond to this feedback? They probably have some emotions too. they probably have some thoughts about this feedback and the situation itself, maybe even some perspective that you are not aware of. So you'll have to consider it going into the feedback, and you'll have to prepare to hear it, because it might change the way that you look at the whole situation too. Last but not least, you've probably heard this before. It's usually more productive to speak in terms of I and we. The word you, it looks like you're pointing a finger at that person. It looks like there's a judgment. It feels like you are targeting them, and it feels unfair. But if you are focusing on positive outcomes, and if you do have clarity of purpose, the truth is it probably is more likely an I statement. I noticed. I'd like you to. I want to remind you that you start with the word I at the very beginning instead of you. And the word we is also really powerful. We have sales targets that we're looking to meet. That's why I'd like to ask that you, the word we, we're in it together. It won't be as isolating. You'll be signaling that you are on this person's side and that you're here to help, and that the reason you're giving the feedback is all about helping them to be more successful. So prepare yourself in all these ways, and it will also be a little bit easier if when you are having the actual conversation, it's soon after, very soon after, whatever you observed that needs to be addressed. Now, in a few minutes here, I'm going to give you the actual conversation. I'll give you 5 steps for the conversation. I'll give you a little model that you can use to have this conversation. But these are just the setting. I'm still asking you to envision preparing for the conversation and conducting the conversation. You'll be more in control of it if you've put some planning into it. And although it's taking me many minutes to describe this, it will take you very few minutes to actually prepare. And after you've done this a few times and you've gone through this mental checklist, it's going to come naturally. So you're giving the feedback, the candid feedback, as soon as possible after the situation has occurred. That way it's still fresh in everyone's mind. It isn't magnified by other situations. It's not becoming diluted by multiple things that creep in after time has passed. It's just candid about this one thing. I think it's a good idea to sit on the same side of a table or to sit at a round table. And that might sound hokey, but the truth is when you sit behind your desk from a position of authority where it's your space and you own it, immediately the other person is in a position that feels less powerful. And if you're going to indicate to them that you're on the same side and that you're here to help, relying on that positional power might not be your best tactic. I know one sales manager, he's fantastic. When he has candid feedback to give people, he takes them on a walk. Now, everybody knows that if you get to go on a walk, it's going to be for some feedback. But here's the funny thing. People like these walks. They've had so many of them, it's so routine for every single person on the team that they know the walks are meant to help them get better and that they're just conversations. Sometimes people even ask, hey, can we go on a walk? And they ask for feedback. So look for ways that you can signal that this is us and we're in it together. When you give the feedback, you're not going to focus on the person. This is not a personal attack. It's about a single situation or a single issue, and we've all got them. So you'll be able to focus on that narrowly as possible. One of the things that you will have done, especially if you listened to last month's webinar in this series, if you haven't, you can go back and find it on the Deb Calvert channel, but you're going to be receptive yourself to feedback. You'll be inviting other people to give you feedback, and as you do that, you're going to model for them how to gracefully and productively accept feedback, and that way you'll have been prepared. The whole team will have been prepared because they see you doing it too. Now this says to avoid negative statements, and that might surprise you because so much of the candid feedback we give, especially the feedback that we have all this emotional angst about, well, it is negative. It's not glowing, positive, complimentary, but it's not just a tear down either. It's not a criticism alone. It's going to include suggestions for how to improve and do things better. So to avoid a negative statement, what you do is you keep it neutral. Instead of saying, you never make your numbers, I'm getting sick of standing up for you, you would say, the situation is that you haven't made goal in the 6 months that you've been here, and we need to turn this around. It's different because it factually states what we know, and it powerfully puts the we, I'm here to help, in the situation. Okay, now you're going to offer some encouragement. I'm giving you this feedback because I want you to succeed. I'm providing this feedback to you because I think you can do this. I'm offering you this feedback because you do so many things well, and this is the one thing that's holding you back. Whatever is true, we put a little encouragement into it. You know, the word encouragement, or to encourage, it means to put courage into. And the time when people need courage, not false, not insincere, but genuine courage that comes from praise and recognition and appreciation, the time they need that most is when they're struggling, when the work is hard, when you're asking for change. Be sure that you let them know your intention is to help them. Now here's how to start the conversation. These little scripts, if you will, these will help you to avoid triggering a defensive response. They will help you to get the conversation opened up if you want a two-way dialogue, if you want to understand what's really going on here, if you want the other person to feel like their voice has been heard. These conversation starters, they keep you in control of the conversation, but they don't let you sidestep the fact that other people need to feel dignified, that they need to feel heard. So you might say any one of these 4 statements. You might say something like, I'd like to discuss your call volume, and I'd like to start by understanding your point of view. Now, everybody knows, you know, and so does the seller, that in this situation, let's say they're only making half as many outbound calls as your activity standards say they should make. You know that, and so do they. So instead of saying, look, your outbound calls are only at 25 this week, that's a problem, which would be one way of handling it. Instead, you're inviting them to tell you what's going on. It's obvious that there's a problem. It's obvious that you want to change. What isn't obvious yet in the conversation is their perspective, where they're coming from. And inviting this means that they're more likely to take ownership of it. What you're likely to hear in response to a statement like, I'd like to discuss your outbound call volume, and I'd like to start by understanding your point of view, what you're likely to hear is something along the lines of why, real or perceived, why there's a barrier for them in reaching that call volume. And then you've got something to work with. That's what you're after, is something to work with. These statements are, you're welcome to use them, they're effective, but there are an infinite number of similar kinds of statements you could make to open up a candid conversation, to signal 2 things, that we're going to talk about the problem and that it's going to be a two-way dialogue. There are times when you simply need to give the feedback, and it does not need to be a two-way conversation. Times when you already understand the other perspective, or times when it's non-negotiable, no matter what the problem, or times when you've had these kinds of conversations before where it was a two-way dialogue. And those are especially good times to use the 3W feedback model. You might have seen this in the previous session about giving effective feedback. I'll review it just in case you haven't attended that session. This is just a super simple model for giving people feedback. And it forces you to follow most of the guidelines that we looked at on the previous slides. The first thing that you do in the 3W model is you state what the situation is. You state what you observed, not what you heard from other people, not what you suspect, but just what is factual and observed. It's objective because you're just restating the facts of your observation. And you include specifics because you don't want to be overly generalized. It would sound something like this. It would sound something like, I noticed that you didn't speak today in our group sales meeting. You declined to offer your thoughts when somebody else asked your opinion, and you shrugged your shoulders and you simply said whatever you think when your colleague asked your opinion. So you're just recapping the situation. You're giving some very specific observations. You are not drawing a conclusion or making a judgment. You don't say things like, well, obviously you don't care. You're not a team player. You're checked out. Those are judgments. In your mind, the natural human inclination is to jump to those conclusions, but they simply aren't fair, and they won't help you when you're giving feedback. So you just describe the situation, and you put in the specifics that you observed in a neutral way. The second W in the 3W feedback model is why. This is where you describe why this matters. And you're still doing this without emotion. You're not making it personal. What you are doing is you're making the link between the behavior you observed and the impact that that behavior has. So in our example that we're using here, you might say something like, you've told me in previous coaching sessions that you want to work on the perception that you're not seen as being strategic. So your participation in these kinds of cross-functional meetings seems like a good opportunity for demonstrating that to other people. Nobody else in that meeting had the same level of understanding that you do about how our decisions will impact your customers in your category. So having said that, what you've done is you've described why it mattered that they participate in that meeting in the way you described in the first W. By the way, if there is no impact, if there's not something important that will result from a change in behavior, then you probably are reacting to something emotional for yourself, a pet peeve or something that's superficial, not really the underlying issue. So if you can't articulate the why, let that be a signal for you that this is not feedback that's all that worthwhile to give to someone. So we've got our what, we've got our why. In the 3W feedback model, the last W is the alternate way you'd like to see things done in the future. This can be something that you state outright. So in the future, I'd like to see you proactively participating in these meetings and responding to your colleagues. If you don't have an answer right away, be sure and tell them that you'll come back to them offline outside the meeting to have that dialogue. You define for them exactly what you'd like to see done differently. If you are in coaching mode, and if you really want to invite the other person's participation in creating a solution, you could do that here, but only if there's more than one way, and only if you have the luxury of time. There's not something that needs to be changed immediately. So you might say, if you're looking to broaden out the dialogue here, you might say something like, considering that you do want to show your capabilities in thinking strategically, what are some options for how you could circle back to give your true feedback to your colleague? And then you'd ask, which one of those options do you feel will be most effective? Okay, let's outline a plan then for how and when you're going to do that. With this model, you're neutralizing the emotions that could be stirred with feedback, and you're making sure to carry it to its logical conclusion that there's something different, and it's clear, it's candid, it's straightforward and direct about what needs to change. Now, I promised you a model for the conversation, so that's your feedback, but let's just talk about any conversation. Maybe it's not feedback, maybe it's not a situation where you are in that supervisory role. This could be with your sales director or VP. It could be with your peers in other departments. It could be with a customer. There are all kinds of times when we need to be candid. And when you need to be candid, when you need to have a dialogue and understand the other person's position, and you need them to understand your position too, here's a 5-part formula for that kind of conversation. You start with inquiry. You want to go into it with an open mind. You're going to seek first to understand and then to be understood. This is where you set aside your assumptions and you demonstrate that you're willing to listen with an open mind. And when you do that, you're modeling to the other party that that's what you want from them too. The law of reciprocity kicks in. Whatever we do, that's how people are most likely to respond to us. So your attitude here of interest and of curiosity and openness, that's going to let the dialogue be more productive. You're also going to have a chance to learn about the other perspective, and you're less likely to have any kind of emotional reactions creeping into the conversation. After step 1, where you've heard the other side, then you take another step that you might not normally take in these conversations. Most people go right to step 3. So step 2 is still ahead of that. Here's where you acknowledge what you heard. This is how you make the conversation safe. And you also are keeping control of it so it doesn't become emotional or defensive. In step 2, you're still modeling what you hope to see as a response to your position. So you simply paraphrase. You explain back what you've heard, and you acknowledge that position. You might also even acknowledge feelings that were expressed or appear to be just under the surface. You can even acknowledge your own feelings in the spirit of cooperation and openness. So you might say something here like, if it's true, you might say something like, you know, I can see that this is a little uncomfortable for you to talk about. I have to admit that I came in feeling pretty uptight about this too. Here's a really important thing I want to point out. Acknowledgement of somebody else's position and somebody else's feelings, that's not the same thing as agreement. Saying, I see that this is really important to you, validates the other person's feelings without validating their position. Now, once you've fully heard the other person out, and really you should ask questions if you have to, let them get it all out, then it's your turn. This is step 3. This is where you're going to clarify your position and advocate for it. And you can do that without minimizing their position or coming across as competitive. This is not about you're wrong, I'm right. This is about stating what's important to you. And it's in addition to what they said, not instead of what they said. So think about this. Let's do steps 1 through 3. Tell me a little bit more about how the situation came about. Tell me a little bit more about your views of the situation. Tell me a little bit more about what led to this. Right? So that's inquiry with an open mind. Thank you for sharing that with me. Step 2. I understand how you got to this position and how you feel about it. That's all. We don't have to agree. We don't have to disagree in step 2. And now in step 3, I might say something like, I really appreciate that you shared that with me. Let me tell you where I'm coming from and how I see this too. There's not a but, there's not an or, there's just an alongside. And now with both positions on the table, we can move into step 4, We can shift the dialogue to some collaborative problem solving. And you could start by saying something like, now that we've each had a chance to understand our positions and what's important to each of us, let's see if we can't come to a solution that will meet as many of our needs as possible. What do you think would work? You could open it up like that if you want to. So we're trying to meet their needs as well as meet our needs. And I promise, in most of the situations where someone else is truly wrong, that they're going to voluntarily back away from their positions and move toward yours because you advocated for them without attacking. Now, you can really keep this part of the conversation positive as long as you're building on the ideas they've offered rather than dismissing them. And if there are some ideas that aren't valid, that are truly, absolutely wrong, you can just sideline those. Start with the ones that are positive, the ones that give you the opportunity to meet in the middle and that set you up for a good collaboration. Give the other person a chance to abandon their ideas and their position. It happens more often than you might think. Step 5, it's not really a step at all. It's the fallback if things aren't going well in step 4. And that is simply to return back to inquiry, back up to step 1, if this process breaks down. In fact, if it breaks down at any point, you do more inquiry. And your inquiry, it should be directed by your intent to reach a solution and to communicate candidly for the good of the organization, for the good of that other person too. So here are some ideas about questions you could use to get back to step 1 and to diffuse any situation that's emotionally charged. You might just say something like, okay, let's step back here. Please help me understand what part of this you're most concerned about. Or maybe you would say something like, okay, hang on, I clearly missed something. Tell me more about that. Tell me why that matters to you. You're going to give them an opportunity to air it all out and to figure it out on their own. You won't do this in a way that becomes laborious or tedious and goes on and on and on. Remember, you have a feedback model you can use when you absolutely have to move things forward quickly and dialogue isn't working. So a few more things about this difficult feedback, a few more tips here. As you're giving people candid feedback, whether it's the 3W feedback or whether it's the 5-part conversation, whether it's something that you had to do right away or whether it's in a one-to-one meeting or annual review, wherever it is that you're giving this feedback and being candid, please keep the word candor in mind. Straightforward, direct, simple. It's one thing at a time. You're not going to mask it in a lot of kindness. And what I mean by that is don't work so hard to be kind that you actually diminish or dilute the feedback that you're giving. That's not very kind at all. It's not kind to make people guess or work for it. It's not kind to protect them from the truth and allow them to keep making the same mistakes because you weren't brave enough, you didn't care enough to give the feedback in a way that was going to help them, truly help them, versus protect their feelings temporarily. If you say something like, hey, I've been hearing a few things about what's going on when you work with the order entry department. You know what I'm talking about, right? That's not fair. Don't do that. It's not fair to say something that is an attack, and it's also not fair to say something that is a chicken way out of saying what you really mean. As long as you keep it behavior-based, not personal, as long as you give specifics, as long as you have the outcome in mind that's positive, and as long as you're giving feedback with the true intent to help somebody, you are giving someone a gift. You're going to do it in a way that's a bit more productive, not causing a defensive response. And then you'll find that it is actually viewed as useful and helpful, and that people will appreciate it. They'll want to go on that walk with you the way they want to go on the walk with the sales manager I told you about. Okay, by way of recap, it's not candid. It's not candid if you don't remain objective, if you fall into your own emotional place where you're now blaming and shaming and finger pointing and personalizing. That's not candid. That's not productive either. It's not candid if you are using hyperbole or superlatives. And it's not candid if you don't include those examples and specifics. If it's not clear, if you're protecting or minimizing, if you're apologizing, saying something like, oh, I hate to have to break this to you, and I'm really sorry, but that just diminishes it. It takes away from it. And if you do this thing called beating around the bush as opposed to getting straight to it, that's not candid either. Every one of these 8 items that you see on screen, they all have problems that you'll be causing. They fester the problem as opposed to addressing it and moving through it quickly. So that's why you want to do the prep work that we talked about at the very beginning. For those who might have joined a little late, by the way, the slides are available for you in the attachments and links, and you're welcome to download those, and you're welcome to be in touch with me too, either with a question here in the live presentation or later on LinkedIn or elsewhere. Okay, candid conversations. The whole purpose of those, the impact of a candid conversation, is that it can cause a transformative change. Right? These are not just conversational transactions. These are important conversations. They allow for bonding and understanding and for people development. They produce what they call in Buddhism the middle way. The middle way is not a compromise along a continuum on a straight line. We're not aiming to meet in the middle. The middle way teaches that there's something higher, that you can transcend the compromise, like you see up here at the apex of the triangle. But that's only attainable if you create something new. With candid dialogue, with the sharing of ideas, with a genuine understanding of the other party's perspective, something new invariably gets produced. And that's the aim, right? We want to reach our way instead of settling for my way or your way. And that's a great place to aim when it comes to candid conversations. If you use that 5-step process for collaborating to solve problems, then you're more likely to get to the middle way. Now, we're going for telling people the truth. And I know everything I've described here, it takes a little bit more time than dodging the conversation or than hoping that they'll figure it out on their own or than giving them some lukewarm feedback that doesn't really make an impression and isn't really very clear. In the short term, it takes more time, an investment of time, to be able to give them that feedback in a way that's productive. But I promise it's worth it, and people will appreciate it, and you'll be more effective as a sales manager when you truly give candid feedback. If you need some additional support, here at People First Productivity Solutions, we do coaching one-to-one with sales managers. And we have some short-term coaching engagements that can be highly productive. I encourage you to send me an email or be in touch with me if you'd like to pursue options like that. Don't forget, we've got the Connect to Sell and the Connect to Lead blogs, as well as the Workplace Conversations e-learning program. It's self-paced so that you can become a stronger manager and you can do it in your own time. Be sure to take the attachments and links. Leave me a little review if you've got some comments for me. And tune in next month. We're going to be talking about an important topic, which is becoming less reactive and more proactive as a sales manager.